Hi everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wondered if you remember things differently depending on whether you read them or hear them, especially if you speak more than one language? Well, this new study might have a fascinating answer. Today we are diving into how we remember stuff we learn, and how it changes based on whether we read it or hear it, and how well we know different languages. Imagine trying to learn something new for school, maybe from a textbook, and then later hearing about it in a lecture. How does your brain put that together, especially if you're bilingual? This research got me thinking because, honestly, most of what we learn, especially in today's world, comes at us from all sorts of angles. We read articles, listen to podcasts, watch videos, and attend lectures. And for many of us, we're doing this in more than one language. This study tackles that exact challenge, looking specifically at people who grew up speaking Spanish at home, but learned English in school. They're often called heritage speakers. The big question is, does it matter how we get information like reading versus listening? And does that change depending on the language? So the researchers had two main ideas. First, they thought that if information is presented in the same way both times you encounter it, like reading a text and reading it again, your memory will be better. This is kind of like the encoding specificity principle, which basically says that retrieval is easier when the conditions at the time of learning match the conditions when you try to remember it. Second, they wondered if for bilinguals, how good they are at reading versus listening in each language would make a difference. Think about it. If you grew up speaking Spanish mainly by hearing it, but learned to read and write mostly in English, that could totally change how you learn and remember things in each language. To test this, they gathered a group of Spanish-English bilingual students. They gave them pairs of made-up science facts. For each pair of passages, one of the facts would be updated or corrected in the second passage, and the other fact would stay the same. This is where the discourse updating comes in, which is basically your brain updating its knowledge base. They presented these passages in 4 different ways: reading, then listening, then reading, and reading, then listening. They did this in both English and Spanish. After each pair, participants had to recall what they learned and then answer multiple choice questions to check their understanding. Now, here is where it gets really interesting. For the stuff that was revised or updated, there was a clear pattern. When the material was in Spanish, participants remembered it better and were more accurate when they heard it, especially in the second passage. This was true no matter how good they were at speaking either language, but when the material was in English, they did better when they read it. This is a big deal because it is the opposite of what you might expect if you just assumed reading is always better for learning. For facts that stayed consistent, the pattern was a bit different. English language dominance really mattered for accuracy, especially when the second passage was written. But for Spanish, the modality didn't seem to affect accuracy as much. This suggests that how well you know a language and how you typically use it reading for English, maybe listening more for Spanish, plays a crucial role in how you remember and update information. So, what does this all mean? The study found a clear language-dependent modality effect for heritage speakers. The way they learned in Spanish versus English really mattered. They did better with auditory Spanish and written English, which lines up with how they probably learned and used those languages growing up and in school. It means that for understanding and remembering new information, especially when it is being updated, the combination of language and how you receive that information listening or reading is super important. This is really important for education. If you're a heritage speaker, your brain might process and store information differently depending on the language and the modality. So a lecture in Spanish might be just as effective or even more effective than reading a text for certain kinds of learning, especially for updating knowledge. They also found that when the information was revised, making it more cognitively demanding, the modality differences became even more pronounced. What they didn't find evidence for was the idea that simply matching the modality across the 2 passages made a big difference. For example, reading a text, then reading another text didn't necessarily lead to better memory than reading a text, then listening to one, especially in the context of updating information. This suggests that when we're really trying to update our understanding, the meaning and our existing knowledge are more important than whether the form of the information read or heard was the same. The researchers point out that general comprehension skills seem to be the same across modalities and languages. The real difference comes from individual differences in how we use languages and the skills we develop in reading versus listening for each one. Because heritage speakers often develop these different strengths, especially in their home language, which they might have heard more than read, these modality differences become really apparent. It is not just about being good or bad at a language, but how we've experienced and used it. This research could be a game changer for how we think about learning. It challenges the idea that reading is always superior for learning academic content. For bilinguals, especially heritage speakers, leveraging their strength in auditory processing for their home language could be key to more effective learning and updating of information. This study is a fantastic example of how we can explore complex cognitive processes by looking at unique populations like heritage speakers. It highlights that when we talk about learning and memory, we can't ignore the impact of language, culture, and our personal experiences with different ways of taking in information. So, if you're bilingual, or if you're an educator working with bilingual students, remember that the mode of delivery matters. For Spanish, listening might offer an unexpected advantage, especially for tricky, updated information. For English, reading might still be king, but the research suggests that with high enough proficiency, people can become flexible enough to learn equally well from both. The key takeaway is that our language experiences shape how we learn, and that's pretty amazing. What did you think of these findings? Have you ever noticed yourself remembering things better when you hear them versus reading them, especially in different languages? Let me know in the comments below. If you like this dive into language and memory, give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more fascinating research, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next episode. Well, I'll see you next time.